So first of all, can you introduce yourself for the coaches in Taiwan?
Yes, absolutely. Well, my name is Cisco Reyes. I'm currently an associate professor at Linfield University in McMinnville, Oregon. I've been at Linfield for 6 years, and I've been at two previous universities as an academic in exercise and sports science. At Linfield, not only am I an associate professor that teaches within our exercise science department, but I'm also the graduate program coordinator for our sports science and analytics master's program. So I oversee the grad students that are working with our teams, all the sport technology, and then obviously their research that they're working on and the outreach that we have with our community when it comes to incorporating sports science or introducing sports science to our high schools, club teams, really just around the area. In addition to my duties at Linfield, I'm also the owner and performance coach at the Reyes Lab here in Tigard, Oregon, just outside Portland, which is where I reside and where I live. So I use strength training as a way to elevate and empower youth athletes, really focusing on middle school and high school kids, getting them ready for competition beyond high school, but most importantly, just trying to help them understand and feel confident about themselves when it comes to using strength training as a way to make themselves feel better, whether it's for sports or just, establishing good daily lifestyles that will carry with them, beyond into adulthood. I'm an active member of the National Strength and Conditioning Association. I was the former state director here in Oregon for many years, and now I'm on the executive board for the special interest group within the NSCA that deals with sport technology and performance technology. So kind of the sports science special interest group within the NSCA. So very active. I love the things that I do, the projects that I have, the people that I work with. And really excited to be here with you.
Appreciate that, man. So, and also I love the post on your Instagram.
Thank you.
So,
yeah.
Today I kind of want to focus on jumping and the tests and all those metrics. So, I know there's coaches in Taiwan are interested in what people call the 6 phases of counter movement jump. And I noticed that in your Instagram you divide it into 3 phases of the counter movement jump, right? So can you discuss a little bit about the 6 phases of counter movement jump and how you divide it into 3 phases?
Yeah, so I think the 6 phases that you're referring to is more of the encompassing the entire jump, in general. You've got the waiting phase. So when you are doing jumping on a force plate, it's been known that you need to have that quote unquote quiet period where the force plate and the software can record the person's body weight. And that's obviously going to create the baseline for the other phases. The 3 that I, really focus on is the unweighting, and then the braking, and then the propulsive phase. So those are the 3 primary phases on what the athlete's doing to prepare themselves to jump. And then I think the other 2 phases that comprise the 6 total that you're referring to is obviously being airborne, and then you've got the landing phase. So if you add in the weighing with the airborne and the landing, those 3, in addition to the 3 that I talk about, which is again the unweighting, the braking, and the propulsive, then that comes up with the 6 total phases of the jump. I definitely do not mean to say that the other phases aren't important, because they are. I mean, some would argue, and I would absolutely agree with them, that the landing phase is critical, because that's when most injuries occur, is during the slowing down or the specific landing forces that are placed upon the body from a jump. I just focus more on the eccentric, isometric, concentric phase of the preparation of the jump, because I think understanding the metrics of those 3 phases can really give practitioners an insight in the process and the organization of how the outcome or the output is achieved, which is jump height.
Cool. So, since we talked about like 6 phases of like counter movement jump, or like the 3 phases you mentioned, can we discuss a little bit about like the 4 phases of like squat jump?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I know that's a very common test that's used. Was there any of the 4 phases specifically that you wanted to get to?
Sorry again?
Were there any specific phases within those 4 that you really wanted to talk about?
Basically, like go through all of them.
Okay, so just so that you and I are on the same page, when you're talking about the 4 phases, you're removing the unweighting and the braking, right? As I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. So yeah. So the biggest thing with the squat jump is you're removing that counter movement. So you're removing the stretch shortening cycle, the stretch reflex, the wind up, whatever you want to refer to, and you're really looking at the pure concentric part of the exercise. So when you talk about the 4 phases of the squat jump, you still have the weighing, because that's, again, critical, because that's going to create the baseline for how force is going to change throughout the rest of the movement pattern. You're going to have the propulsive. You still have the, being airborne, or the air phase, and then you have the landing phase. So those are your 4 phases of the squat jump. What makes the squat jump really important is when you look at the output. So the jump height or the takeoff velocity, since those 2 are mirror images and directly correlated to each other. If you look at the jump height during the squat jump and then compare it to the jump height of the counter movement jump, again, when you remove the wind up or the loading phase of the jump in the squat jump, you really can start to see a profile and a pattern in how the athlete is getting to their specific output. Are they using a lot of stretch shortening cycle? Are they using a lot of momentum? Or are they purely concentric and they're just strong, strong for their respective body weight? That's when you see the squat jump outputs, really, really high. The nice thing about certain pieces of technology, specifically, looking at force plates, is that you can't cheat a squat jump on a force plate. And what I mean by that is, if the software and the hardware detects any sort of counter movement, no matter how small, it's going to make the jump not count. And so you're going to have an athlete, do it again. And human nature, I mean, we're very plyometric. We use our muscles and their properties in order to be as efficient as possible. And that does require, or we do use the wind up phase, or that, stretch shortening cycle, or the stretch reflex. So there is an adjustment period in really teaching athletes how to perform the squat jump test correctly. But the feedback with the force plate is very, very helpful, because they can see exactly maybe when and how much they're dipping, and then you can correct the squat jump from there. But it's nice to be able to get, again, the output from the counter movement, the output from the squat jump, and then that type of metric, or that specific ratio, you can really use to guide your program based off of, do they need more pure strength work, specifically concentric, maybe even isometric, or do they need more of the explosive dynamic type of strength, ballistic strength, if their ratio is leaning one way or the other?
So there's like a lot of coaches using like force plates right now. Besides like squat jump and counter movement jump, is there like other like tests you would like recommend like coaches to do on a force plate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually just thinking about that this morning, and running some further tests with the athletes here at the Reyes Lab, as well as our student athletes at Linfield University. But the good old drop jump can be extremely valuable when you're looking and trying to measure an athlete's elastic strength. So, you've got your different levels of strength. Absolute strength is more of that basic powerlifting. And the elastic strength is the ability to overcome resistance and loads with specific degrees of rebound or again, stretch. So the drop jump is where, you know, you're standing on anywhere between a 12 to an 18-foot box. You have the athlete step off, they hit the middle of the force plate with both feet at the same time, and they try to jump as high as they can, as fast as they can off the ground. So you kind of tell them, you know, we don't want to see you have a big wind up when you get on the ground, like, you know, track and field terms. We want to see you just kind of ankle off the ground. So your knees don't bend that much, your hips don't bend that much, just hit the ground and then push off hard with your feet and get as high off the ground as you can. So that can be a direct indication of their elastic strength. So you're looking at their reactive strength index, which is just their jump height divided by their ground contact time. So the higher the number, that means they're able to get off the ground in a super, super short amount of time, which is, again, a good indication of their elastic strength. The multi-rebound test is another type of test that can be used on a force plate that you can get towards the same conclusion. And when it comes to their elastic strength, so we've done some preliminary testing with our student athletes at Linfield where they have their hands on their hips. They're not necessarily stepping off of a box, but they do one counter movement jump that kind of gets them going. And then as soon as they're in the air and they land again, that's when they kind of get back to the ankling, and they do as many of those kind of ankling type of jumps. And I believe it's like 7 seconds. And then with that data, you can get their peak RSI, their peak reactive strength index during one of those jumps, their average reactive strength index, their average ground contact time, their average or peak jump height. You know, those are the primary tests, at least that we've looked at and we've used when we're trying to, again, profile an athlete on how their neuromuscular system is being used and being organized in order to, in this situation, do a counter movement jump or a depth jump or a drop jump, I'm sorry. And again, that stuff is directly correlated to a lot of different athletic skills, which is why the counter movement jump is so popularly used in tests.
So those like all using like both legs, like bilateral jump, right? Do you do any like unilateral jump?
So the nice thing about, that's a great question. So the nice thing, the reason why I didn't mention it is because the nice thing about the Hawkin Dynamics force plate that we use is that they are two smaller force plates that you stand on with each foot. So you can actually see right and left differences during a bilateral type of jump. As of right now, we do not do any single leg type of jumps, whether it's like, again, a counter movement jump off of one leg or a multi-rebound hop since they're on one leg. We haven't explored that. We haven't played around with that just yet, just because of time, efficiency, and really manpower. But I mean, you and I both know it's used a lot. It's used quite a bit. There's a bit of a learning curve that we've kind of noticed during our initial testing with force plates and single leg jumping. A lot of athletes just aren't familiar or used to it. So then therefore their effort goes down because they're just trying to get used to what we're trying to get them to do. So that's why so far we've really just stuck with the bilateral types of jumps.
Cool. So the next thing I want to discuss is about like what kind of metrics should we be looking at? And I know there's a like paper posted by Chris Bishop, which I talked before, but still I'm interested in like the post you mentioned on like countermovement jump. Besides jump height, what should we be looking at? And at each phases, what does that mean?
Good. Great question. So when we're looking when we're looking at a movement, so again, in this situation, we're talking about, you know, vertical jump. It's really easy to only look at the output or the outcome. We have a lot of technology and just tools in general that can measure output, and it's something. It's really better than nothing. And I can even tell you that when you look at the research and how jumping is used to monitor, you know, neuromuscular fatigue and readiness, jump height is still very valuable. You can get a lot of information from jump height in regards to being prepared, being ready, but also just training status. Like, are you progressing through the training itself? Now, for people who are, fortunate enough to have a force plate, so you can get into more of the whys behind the outcome. So how did an athlete get to a 16-inch vertical jump? 1, 2, 3, 4. There are probably 5 metrics that at least I like to pay attention to. Again, doesn't mean that the other ones aren't important, but when you're dealing with sport technology, you can just get masses of information and data that it can be overwhelming. So what does the literature say? What do practitioners like you say? And I just kind of compile them together and say, let's just look at these, 3 to 5 that mean a lot. One of them is the modified reactive strength index. So it's just MRSI. So, and that's different than the reactive strength index that I talked about with the drop jumps. So the modified reactive strength index, or the MRSI, is a calculation of jump height divided by how long it took the athlete to perform that counter movement jump. So with our technology, again, there's the weighing phase where they have to stand still for about 3 seconds. Then after the 3 seconds, the software automatically will give a beep and then a visual flash on the tablet. And so we instruct our athletes that as soon as you hear the beep and see the flash, start your jump. So there should be no delay after that flash and the beep. And that's recommended from Hawken themselves. So that way we can measure the total time it takes for them to go through the unweighting, braking, and propulsive, and then how that corresponds to how high they actually jumped off the ground. So if you have someone with a high MRSI, that means they can get off the ground and they can do it very quickly. So it doesn't take them long to go through those 3 stages before they leave. Then obviously vice versa, if you have a low MRSI, that means it takes you a while to get going, and or you don't jump very high. The output's just not there. The other 3 that we look at, braking rate of force development. So that is how much force you are using to create energy into the vertical jump. The second one would be the average relative propulsive force. So when we're talking about relative, we're factoring in their body weight into it. So it's easier to compare from person to person. That average relative propulsive force can give practitioners a sense of how they're able to transfer the force from the braking phase and then leading that into the propulsive phase. The third metric would be the relative propulsive impulse. So impulse not only takes force into the equation, but it also time and duration. So when you see athletes with a high impulse, it means that they're either producing a lot of force and or they're producing force for a prolonged period of time, which again can explain why they get to a specific outcome in this situation of jump height. So within those 3 metrics, we kind of look at the balance between the 3. If you have someone that has an extremely high braking rate of force development, they're able to use eccentric strength to create that, again, that force. But then if their average relative propulsive force is low in respect to the other 2, that means they're having a hard time transferring that force and then getting it up into the vertical direction, for their jump. When you're looking at, let's say, again, the balance between the 3, and you have someone whose relative propulsive impulse is low, then that means that they're not able to produce force for a prolonged period of time, which then becomes a possible range of motion issue. Maybe they're not able to extend their hip through a full range of motion. Maybe they're not able to extend their ankle or plantar flexor ankles through a full range of motion. So looking at those 3 metrics and how they balance with each other can give people an indication of, is it more eccentric strength we need to do? Do we need to focus more on relative body strength, which is that average relative propulsive force, and then isometrics to transition from eccentric to concentric? Or is it a range of motion issue? Like they can produce a lot of force, but they don't produce force for a long period of time. So maybe their joints just aren't allowing them to move through a full range of motion. So a physical therapist can come into play and say, all right, let's look at your hip. It's locked up. Let's try to get that hip to go into extension a little bit further. The fifth metric that kind of goes hand in hand with the MRSI is the counter movement depth. So how quickly do they dip? I was actually just running some data with our student athletes at Linfield, and we've got certain teams that seem to use a different strategy in the vertical jump, only looking at their counter movement depth. We've got some athletes who really like to squat down far in order for them to get up. And we've got certain teams and athletes who don't need to squat down as far to get up. And I think that's an indication of the demands of their respective sport. Looking at, let's say, something like baseball versus volleyball, where volleyball, you know, they're pretty much upright most of the time and they have to get up off the ground quick, that they don't need that, you know, that big squat down or that big dip into their wind up. So again, a lot of metrics, you know, 3 to 5, those are the 3 to 5 that we look at in addition to jump height. Again, even those 3 to 5 can be overwhelming at times, but at least those 3 to 5 metrics, you start to get an idea of what the person looks like and how they're using their, or I should say, organizing their neuromuscular system to be able to propel themselves up, because not everybody jumps the same.
Love it. Love it. Just to summarize, because I was like taking some notes. Can you like give us like which 5? Can you like just mention it?
Yeah. Let's go through that one again. So one metric is reactive strength index modified. Hand in hand with that is the counter movement depth, so how far they dip down. So those two are kind of related. Those two kind of go together. And then the other three go together in respect to how they're balanced out, if one's higher than the other. So the first one is the braking rate of force development. That leads into the average relative propulsive force. And then that leads into the relative propulsive impulse. So those are the 5 that I talked about.
Great. Appreciate that. And I'm glad that you brought up like modified reactive strength index, because when I was like teaching coaches about like counter movement jump, what kind of metrics are they should they be looking at? There's sometimes there's gonna be like discussion about should we pick like reactive strength index or like a modified reactive strength index. So can you like discuss a little bit about like how is it like these two metrics are different, and in which situation we should be looking at like reactive strength index, and what kind of situation we should be looking at like modified reactive strength index?
Good question. That's a really good question. So, you know, you get the 2 metrics through 2 different tests. And one reason why we've kind of tabled or shelved the drop jumps to get reactive strength index is the learning piece. So we found with our, again, at least with our student athletes, they've had a hard time grasping the drop part. And so we didn't really feel like we were confident in the data that we were getting, because really, I don't know if it was maybe again, it's kind of hard to explain, but we weren't really feeling comfortable in our data because we had to give them so many trials until they were like, oh, I get it. And then you've got fatigue at that point, because they've done like 7 trials. And we're like, all right, well, you know, maybe we'll come back tomorrow and we'll do it again. So it's something that they have to practice. At least with the MRSI, or the modified reactive strength index, you can still get that during a movement that they're all familiar with, right? So being able, you know, again, total time to take off in respect to jump height. I think there are certain athletes and certain types of athletes who could benefit, or I guess I should say practitioners can benefit from testing their RSI, because you'll have a good idea that they're probably going to be really bouncy or not. So I'm going to use high jumpers for an example. I don't know of a high jumper who's very heavy footed. Most high jumpers that I encounter are extremely bouncy. So do I really need to go through an RSI test with them versus, let's say, who would be another, an offensive lineman in football, or maybe someone that's where that reactive piece or that elastic piece is not very important to their skill or the types of skills that they have to perform. Again, the MRSI gives us a lot. It's easier to teach. If anything, we don't have to teach, anything. It's just more just cueing that we want you to jump as high and as fast as you can as soon as you hear this beep or see this flash. Again, I am a fan of the RSI test. I like it. It's just a little bit more difficult to get valid and reliable data with it.
Great. But just to give the audience a more map out how should we plan their tests when they want to gather different information or different data. If they want to look into the stiffness besides RSI or besides drop jump, is there other tests they could do
to get an idea? You said of tendon stiffness.
Yeah.
So the one of the metrics within the Hawken, at least that's what we use, is Hawken dynamics force plate, is there is a stiffness metric. There's a stiffness number. We haven't looked into that. We're not 100% sure exactly what that means. The rebound test, where you just have them ankle off the force plate, or even if you don't have a force plate, maybe just give them a certain amount of time and say you've got 5 seconds. How many jumps can you get off the ground, in 5 seconds? I mean, that's just a stopwatch and counting. I think those are really simple ways to get an idea of tendon stiffness. Again, being bouncy, Coach Jimmy Radcliffe here at the University of Oregon uses the term, are you a bouncy ball or are you a tomato, type of thing. So being able to, again, transfer that energy and be elastic like a bouncy ball, or when you hit the ground, are you just kind of plopping? And if you just have someone do the, ankling or, multi, rebound tests and just say, you got 5 seconds, go do as many as you can. You should be able to get a sense at that point, even qualitatively, this person's got good stiffness because they transition well, or it takes them a while, to get off the ground.
Love that. And I don't want to circle back to a topic like you mentioned. It's also an interesting topic which I really want to dive into, is the counter movement depth for the jump performance. Mm-hmm. So, just like you mentioned, if let's say in the same sport like basketball, different position or different types of player, they have different types of jumping, and they also have different counter movement depths. So can you discuss a little bit about what in let's say different depth, if someone squat just really squat down a lot to get a jump height, or they don't need squat that much and they be able to jump higher, what does that mean?
Yeah. So when you look at counter movement depth, again, that specific metric, again, like I said, it goes hand in hand with the MRSI, because it gives you a sense of how much do they need to wind up, quote unquote, wind up, in order to achieve the specific outcome of a jump height. So I'm going to use volleyball as an example. So you've got your middle blockers. I'll just stick with the middle blockers for right now. So they're right up against the net. They don't have a lot of time based off of their responsibilities to do this huge counter movement jump and then be able to jump up and, let's say, block a hit or go up for a hit. They've got to be able to go down, wind up quick, and they got to get off the ground, because even when they hit the ground after that, they're probably going to have to get up off the ground again in order to, again, block a ball or pick it up, if it's coming towards them. So that's why that counter movement depth is critical, because that can give you a sense of not only positional demands, like you had mentioned, like in basketball, volleyball, but then that can give you an indirect measurement of how explosive they are. So if I have, again, I'll just go back to volleyball. Let's say I've got like 5 middle blockers, and all of them are roughly jumping around, let's say 10 inches. We use inches here in the US. But I noticed that 2 of them, their counter movement depth is only about, let's say 8 centimeters. And then the other ones, theirs is like 14. So they all jump the same. Again, output's the same, but I've got this collective group that can actually get to the same height, and they don't need to squat down or wind up as far or as much. So that can be monitored for fatigue. So one thing is, watching their counter movement jumps over time during a season, because if you have someone who is, again, jumping 10 inches at the start of the season, and their counter movement depth is, again, let's just say like 8 centimeters, but then by the middle of the season, their jump height's the same, but you've noticed that they've had to squat down further to get to that height. That's kind of telling you that their neuromuscular system is not feeling twitchy. It's not fast. It's not explosive. Like they're needing more time to wind up, which again will go hand in hand with their MRSI. So, looking at the 5 metrics I talked about, that counter movement depth can really uncover a lot into the athlete's strategy and how they're getting to that output by either squatting down a lot or winding up a lot, or not winding up that much, which again leads into more of the dynamic or explosive and even elastic strength capabilities.
So, if let's say, like you mentioned, a middle blocker, if we like squat down too much or like wind up too much, is there like a certain thing you would do to like improve that?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously training for more of that, elastic strength. So being able to produce force, quickly, and and the elastic strength side is it's highly neural, so therefore it needs to be practiced a lot, because of the specific adaptations with something twitchy like elastic strength. It comes really quickly, but then it can go away really quickly. So I've just even reading stuff about how you need to be able to practice elastic strength on a regular basis, almost daily. So when we're talking about, again, we're going back to this example of a middle blocker, being able to do, let's say, like quarter squats, concentric, right? So maybe I remove the eccentric piece and I just want them to focus on the propulsive phase, but I'm not giving them the full range of motion of a deadlift or a squat or whatever it may be. You can do just very low level type of plyometrics with either hurdles, and just like 6-inch hurdles, low hurdles, and just trying to get them off the ground quick. And just really teaching them how to organize themselves in order to push off the ground hard, but push off the ground in a very short amount of time. I am not one, this is just my general philosophy, I am not one to come up with extremely elaborate types of exercises. I really like to stick to the basics and maybe just tweak them, a little bit. Without getting too far into, the weeds when it comes to sport technology, but, using something like velocity-based training protocols. So whether you're using, an accelerometer or a linear position transducer, you can give them direct feedback with traditional strength training exercises on trying to get them to move with intent and move quickly, either with an eccentric or without an eccentric. So, when we're talking about this middle blocker and improving her elastic strength, it's got that eccentric component, but can you still get up off the ground without needing to dip as far? So again, starting from that static quarter squat, and then can you just go up from there?
Nice. So, I noticed that for the 5 metric you pick, there's not really like a peak power or like peak force. Why don't you pick like peak power, like peak force, or something like peak eccentric for these kind of like metrics?
Yeah, so the breaking rate of force development metric, that gives you a really good insight in the eccentric capabilities for that athlete. You know, again, it's about creating energy and creating force going into the jump. I like to look at peak propulsive force. I just don't really use it that much to compare or you know, with the program design. You know, with the average relative propulsive force, that means a little bit more to me, because again, it's relative. So you're taking their body weight into consideration, and how relative strength is really important for explosive types of exercises. You know, you talk about, you know, it's physics. Acceleration equals force divided by mass. So if I can improve my force output in respect to decreasing my mass, then I'm going to be able to increase my, you know, my overall, you know, acceleration. So that's why, you know, peak force is kind of cool to look at, to see how much force you're actually, the maximum amount of force you're able to produce. But when we're talking about over a movement and how it's compared to my body weight, it's easier to compare from athlete to athlete once you make it relative versus just peak. Now, we can use peak propulsive force to calculate the dynamic strength index, which is, you know, now you're factoring in the vertical jump and the isometric mid-thigh pull, and that gives you a glimpse into their strength potential and how they're able to utilize and express their force capabilities in either a dynamic situation like the counter movement jump, or something more static like the isometric mid-thigh pull. So that's where I would use, or that is where I use the peak propulsive force, is in the examination of their dynamic strength index.
So for like, if let's say if it's for like athletes like return to play, is it gonna be the same like 5, or is it gonna be different? And for like using like force plates, do you also look at like the asymmetry of like different like the right leg and the left leg?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You know, again, because of our setup, you know, we're able to look at right and left during a bilateral movement. So whether it's the propulsive part or the landing part, we can look at both. I'm just going to use myself as an example, because I've been kind of, you know, obviously geeking out with what I can do. You know, I'm almost 8 months post-surgery from a torn Achilles. So looking at my jumps before and then looking at my jumps now, my output's nearly identical at this point. So again, I'm 7.5 to 8 months post-surgery, and I'm jumping just as high as I was before I got hurt. I mean, we're talking just within an inch. The output's different, or I'm sorry, the process is totally different now. You know, I'm favoring one side more than the other, you know, obviously. The timing of how I'm pushing with my right and left, the relative timing to complete the skill of jumping, it's not the same. The range of motion, so going back to the metrics we talked about, my relative propulsive impulse is lower, which means that I'm not producing force as long of a time as I was before. So using those 3 metrics, and my counter movement depth is not the same, because I'm not able to squat down as far, because I have a locked up ankle. And so, you know, as you're well aware, you know, if the ankle can't dorsiflex, you're not going to be able to get into a good squatting position, whether it's for a jump or a back squat exercise, or just, you know, squatting down to pick something up, or, you know, play with your kids, whatever it may be. So using those metrics can still provide really good input on, is this person really ready to return to play? Like you said, the output's the same, but with those 3 to 5 metrics, we can start to get a movement pattern that shows that they're not quite the same as they were before.
Like this, love this, love this. So when like using force plate, is it possible to like probably like determine like when an athlete is able to go back, or probably to like guess sorry to use that word.
That's the ultimate question when you talk about return to play. You know, it's never, it's not as concrete as saying like, okay, you've got 80% of your range of motion back, or you've got 90% of your strength back, you're ready to go. You know, and I think every injury is different, whether you're talking, you know, ruptured Achilles, ACL, torn hamstring, whatever it may be. I think every injury is different, that it's hard to quantify to say, okay, you look ready. And so it's nice to have all this technology and make things very quantifiable, but there definitely is still a qualitative and affective piece as a practitioner to talk to the athlete and get a sense, well, how do you feel? Like the numbers tell us this, you're not too far off right and left side. Like you're off, but it's not too far off. I feel great. I feel how I felt 8 months ago. Like I'm ready to go back. I'm ready to go back and play. You know, no matter who you talk to, everybody's trying to put together a return to play protocol and really try to make it as concrete and as objective as possible. But again, the metrics can be used to create that return to play protocol. It's just hard for me to say that you have to get to this landmark or this threshold, or whatever, you know, what 15% similarities, or I'm sorry, 15% discrepancy between right and left, like anything 15% or below, you're probably good. You're probably good to go. Anything above that, 15, 20, 25% discrepancy between right and left on a vertical jump, you're not ready yet. Even though, again, the output might say something, but if we see a 20% discrepancy, yeah, maybe you're just not ready quite yet.
Cool. Great. So the next question is from the audience and from an athletic trainer who really want to know things about like force plate and like counter movement jump. And what she asked is like, nowadays there's like My Jump app, or like a single piece of like the athlete, when they use something like in the combine, they reach the height and force plates. So what exactly is like these three things are different, and can we like replace, like when can we like use like My Jump or like the thing that we reach besides force plate?
Yes, absolutely. You know, and you know, anytime you're incorporating technology, a lot has to go into the entire team environment so that everybody's benefiting from that technology, and you're not just getting technology because Cisco said so, or it's cool, or you see it here in the US, I'm sure it's the same in Taiwan, like, well, they got one, so maybe we need to get one, too. Not everybody's going to have that luxury to be able to get force plates or have access to force plates. The My Jump app is accurate. And again, we're talking about jump height. It is accurate. It's been published in peer-reviewed journals that it's been validated when compared to a force plate. The only issue with the My Jump app is that it takes time to get one metric, jump height, from one athlete. So if, you know, we just tested women's lacrosse, men's tennis, and women's tennis last Thursday at Linfield. If I used the My Jump app with each of them during that time, I would have been there all day because of how long it takes. But it does give you very accurate jump heights. And it has other types of neuromuscular tests that you can do on there as well. So it is kind of a good bang for your buck purchase. If you're working in a clinic one-on-one with people, do it. Like it's going to be very beneficial for you. Now the Vertec, which is what you're talking about, where you've got the veins that stick out horizontally and you have to come up and touch it. It has honestly been years since I've used a Vertec. It was the go-to device for measuring jump height, 15, 20 years ago, because it's portable. You can take it really anywhere, and it's, the setup and the execution is not very hard. I have not done any sort of comparison between a Vertec and, let's say, the force plate. The jumping technique is going to be different because, as you know, when you're jumping on a force plate, you can't tuck or bend your knees when you're in the air, because that's going to register as higher hang time. And if you ever watch people jump on the Vertec, like they're kicking in the air to get up as high as they possibly can to reach. So to be able to standardize how people jump between the two, that would be a learning curve. I think for some athletes that could sway the results one way, or the other. But again, the NFL Combine, they still use it, and I know a lot of schools that still use the Vertec because you can do, for volleyball, like a running jump into it, and then you reach. It's a lot more applicable to, let's say, volleyball and basketball, because you have to jump and reach for something. You have the reach height that comes into effect. If you really want to make it comparable, if you have a Vertec, when you're measuring jump height, when you're measuring their reach height before their jump height, try to measure with them as far on their tippy toes as possible and not flat-footed. Because if you measure them flat-footed with their reach height and then they jump, you've just added however many inches that is to their jump, which is then not going to make it accurate. If you think about the way the force plate measures jump height, is the very last piece of force that goes into the force plate, it registers that as hang time or air time. So, can you get an athlete to hold a calf raise while you yank on their arm and reach up as high as they possibly can? Again, those are kind of cumbersome setups that could be involved when you're talking about a group of 20 people that you have to measure. But again, a lot of literature about looking at average jump height and taking an athlete's average jump height over time. It's still very sensitive to change when you're talking about training progress and fatigue. The biggest piece of advice is, if you're not using a force plate, is just be as standardized and consistent with your testing, no matter what. So whether it's the setup, the execution, whatever it may be, it needs to be as consistent as possible. Arms, no arms. Counter movement, squat, jump, whatever. Just be as consistent as you can to make that data as meaningful to you and your system as possible.
Great. Love that. So I really love our conversation today. So for those like coaches and therapists or like athletic trainer, which are interested in what we are talking about today, where can they reach out to you, and where can they find those like posts you post on Instagram?
Yeah, so the easiest way is, like you said, just social media on Instagram. My handle is at _Reyes, as you see behind me, RISE _lab. So at _Reyes _lab on Instagram. That's the best way to find me. That's the best way to get a hold of me. As you know, we send messages back and forth. I get the notifications. I love the conversations that we've had through Instagram. I've had other conversations with other professionals that have actually giving me ideas and content. Say, can you compare this to this now? And I'm like, fortunately, we actually have those two things. So I'm hoping actually tomorrow I can go into our lab at Linfield and do a comparison of two other types of technologies for vertical jump specifically. So I make it a point to put educational content out daily, anything, sports science related, technology related, training related. I just want to be able to interact with people like you across the world. I want to learn from you all as well. You all have experiences that I don't. And again, it's all about elevating and empowering. That's my biggest thing. And if we can have conversations and podcasts and interviews like this in the future from, social media, I love it. I think that's a great idea. So yeah, at the Reyes Lab on Instagram.
Appreciate that, man. Appreciate for the time. Love that.
Well, thank you. No, I really appreciated this opportunity. It was nice to chat with you. Again, we've been chatting on Instagram for, a couple of weeks now. So again, thank you very much.
No worries.